would say, without this kind of very strong, stable ties with China. So my question is that how do you think this kind of review the relationship between China and its neighboring countries with this kind of social contract perspective, and why is that so different from what have you seen in the U.S. case?
Yeah, last question.
The question of who you trust and how much you trust the U.S. foreign policy establishment, for example, Xi Jinping, for example, has come up. And I guess I went over a somewhat contrary view to some things that have been said over the long run. I guess I don't see the basis for trusting anyone with a foreign U.S. foreign policy establishment to go the way of peace in response to the rise of China. This strategic defense guidance is sort of scary. I don't know if they use the word containment. There's so much jargon now, but you know, let's rebalance towards the specific with special concern to contain force projection in East Asia. Sounds like containment to me. The U.S. Secretary of State standing on a destroyer with guided missiles in Manila Bay, talking about the need to defend against foreign powers threatening not the South China Sea, but what you call the West Philippine Sea, which I guess is the South China Sea. That's not a sign of destructive conflict now, but 20 years from now, when client states are starting to move from the U.S. to China, when the U.S. is no longer the world's reserve currency and the renminbi is joined it, I guess I wouldn't trust this foreign policy establishment. Who knows? You can trust Xi Jinping to be interested in power. You can trust any U.S. president to be interested in power. It's not a balance of power system, so there's more danger of things getting out of hand. But isn't it important that what Xi Jinping does to certain central power so far makes sense in terms of humane goals in China? Why not be cautiously optimistic and try to sell that as a way of continuing anti-China sentiment that people who want to be aggressive towards China can use in the United States?
So why don't we move this way from Ellen to Andy and the session?
So I mean, I'm not going to answer any one of the three questions, but I think find a theme through it. Because I'm going to answer them all. You know, getting my break. So, 2 years ago, Ken Lieberthal and Juan Pisa wrote this report. I think it was out of Brookings, probably, talking about strategic distrust, which suggests that maybe the problem isn't about conflicting interests, but just not finding common ground, right? In other words, we can finesse this, and we can work it out. I think the questions around the table, and there is no answer. Again, there isn't an answer. Are we in a situation in U.S.-China relations that it is just strategic mistrust, misperceptions, a little bit of problems with the images, or are there fundamentally conflicting interests between the two countries? And just where I'm edging towards pessimism, not optimism, is that over the last couple of years beginning to feel like there are fundamental differences between the two sides, that it's not just about kind of good diplomacy, that we may be on the verge of something that's that goes a lot deeper than that. And that there isn't an easy fix, and that you guys will be thrown in the midst of all that. Not a Cold War per se, but not whatever we've been doing for the past 20 years after the end of the Cold War, when the strategic rationale for cooperation between the United States and China disappeared with the loss of the Soviet Union. Since then, we've just been able to kind of keep moving forward. And I'm not entirely sanguine about the prospects for that in the years to come.
So
also will not answer any. No. So what I will say is that I think that the task that the way that I think about my job, at least interacting with people outside of universities and academia, is to try to improve knowledge and interest and kind of information about China as accurately as possible, and that's really hard. Alan said earlier that all of these stories are wrong, right? Like each individual story is wrong about China, and I think it's actually worse than that. I think each individual story is right. And it's just hard to figure out what the major trend is and what the minor trend is. Like, so everything is happening in China. You can go to one city or one village and they are like really treating their migrants well. Then you can go to another city and they're treating their migrants terribly, shutting down schools. And what's the trend? Is it, are you seeing the kind of like the minor trend, or are you seeing the major trend? And I think trying to identify those things. So, and understanding as best we can what is actually going on. So are the goals humane of what she is doing, or are they not? And I think, how do we change perceptions? We try to inform as accurately as possible the American people and present China in all its complexity. Trying to do anything other than accurately report seems like a political game that I'm not willing to engage in, probably because I'm unsure in my confidence about how well I would be good at. And so I think I just try to show the picture that I see and to try to make sure that I'm talking about, as best I can, the major trend as well as the minor trends.
I think I would follow on that and just say that I think there are these underlying conflicts of interest, but those conflicting interests don't need to necessarily lead to outright armed conflict, but then managing and figuring out what is this genuine conflict and what is the exaggerated conflict, I think is where there's room for a lot of efforts, including those by you, to diffuse these misunderstandings. And I think, particularly as we enter already in the middle of beginnings of an election season, there's a group, Committee of 100, concerned Chinese Americans, who have put out sort of a statement of guidelines, I think, regarding the type of rhetoric that isn't acceptable for criticizing China. And it's fine to criticize China, what the government is doing, but when you start using words like the Chinese blah, then you run into this problem, which is that there is no the Chinese. Or as Ed Mossman put it, it's like this national narrative has splintered into, I don't know, the 1.3 billion Chinese stories, and they're individuals, and there's a great deal of diversity and pluralism. And so figuring out on balance what the overall story requires, acknowledging that there are these other stories within it. And so I would, I guess, echo what Jeremy said in saying that I don't trust in either the American or the Chinese government. That's not fortunately we are academics. This is like what our freedoms, like the definition of what our freedoms are, which is not to have to defend or espouse party line, I guess I should say. And so calling it like it is, I think, is really, really important, and recognizing that both governments have these real deficits in terms of when we put out these ideas or slogans that they often are, there's a lot being lost in there in terms of persuading others on either side of the ocean that their intentions are actually good.
I'll try to actually answer some of the questions. I think the thing to keep in mind with everything that we say is that all this stuff has to be implemented. You've got bureaucracies and institutions on both sides, and they slow things down, and they bias them, and they kind of make them go through various lenses, which is one of the reasons why I'm not as optimistic as I would like to be to answer Allison's question. So, pretty much all the examples that you raised were, or most of them were military in nature. One of the things that it's really unfortunate to me, since I've been going to China, because that includes now the year 88 to 89, was when I first went there, that was the tail end of just a ridiculously generous degree of cooperation between China and the U.S. And one of my favorite stories is that Kissinger was giving China satellite photos in the 1970s that showed the Chinese that peasants were underreporting 20% of the harvest. To the point where my first day in China, I went to the Beijing hotel to change money, and there was couldn't tell the rank, but a US soldier with all the stuff in front of me in line speaking, what seemed to me at the time to be fluent Chinese. And I was thinking, wow, this guy's been here for a while. You could tell that there was some depth, there was some gravitas there. After Tiananmen, it's been pretty much any time there is some sort of a crisis or one side insults the other, the first thing that suffers is military relations. And that should be the last thing that suffers. And so until there's some sort of mechanism in place or some sort of a norm or agreement or something to ensure that that doesn't happen, I think both of us are handicapping ourselves in that respect. Second thing is, Yoyi, are you still there? Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's, I'm thinking about, we're talking about positive sum, zero sum, so I'm going to move to the dark side and talk about zero sum. And I really think there's the sense that I did get, and Jessica prompted this in some of her comments, when I was in China, the thing that people were worried about was, they're like, look, you've got the Pacific Ocean, the US. Let us at least have Southeast Asia. And it creates and yet at the same time, the US sees things like what's happening in Myanmar right now as a really positive development, and is trying to get its foot in the door. And essentially, these potential client states they have a pretty lousy choice. On the one hand, it's, they could be the flavor of the month on the part of the US or the West, and then as soon as, they're no longer in the, they're no longer sexy, then they're out of sight, out of mind. Whereas in China, they have kind of the opposite thing. You have China coming in, and if you'll just indulge me for one anecdote, some of you have heard this, it's really quite extraordinary. So when I was in Myanmar this summer, I was talking to a friend of mine who'd been in Laos for 8 years. And he told me that there was a Chinese company that came in to build a dam, a hydropower station in Laos, and they asked if they could bring, no strings attached. But would you mind if 30,000 workers remained in Laos to work on the project, to maintain it, to manage it, and stuff like that? Seemed to be reasonable. And then when the time came, then the Chinese said, so are you ready for the 30,000 families to come to Laos? And no, I thought you said 30,000 workers, not 30,000 families. Well, no, workers can't come without their families. So then all of a sudden you're talking about 100,000 people, 150,000 people, 200,000 people in a country of 8 million or 5 million, or all of a sudden that that becomes an Anschluss, right? So what is going on? What choices do they have? And then from the kind of the geopolitical perspective, it's this idea of, does the U.S. let China have some breathing room, or do we see that as, or do we not want to put it in terms of, this set of alliance, this alliance versus this alliance? It's without the type of relationship, military security, tight security relationship that we might have had in admittedly simpler times. That's a tough call. And Dick, I don't trust anybody. We have survival mechanisms, and I think I'm with Jeremy. I think Jeremy's interpretation is exactly right. I think she is doing the right thing. That's what's required of him. It's not something that we might like. It's not something that we might, it's not something that we would want to kind of institute at home. But it's something that other means and methods have not worked, and the problem has remained the same. The problem, I think that I don't really necessarily see it as a question of trust, but what I see it as a question of, again, local politics, but not on the Chinese side, on the US side. What I mean by that is, every time China does something that seems distasteful to some group in the United States, that gives them a lot of purchase in terms of getting their message across. So if you've got, if you have birth control policy, that allied right to life people here against China with far left feminists, or making strange bedfellows against China's treatment of women. And this was all or intellectual property. You know, a lot of countries, you know, mess with intellectual property. China is one of the biggest, and even when it wasn't, it was treated as such. It provides a platform. You know, I mean, you can't really get the same type of purchase for your argument, you know, on the Hill. You know, if you're a lobbying group, you say, you know, Ukraine really hurts U.S. intellectual property. You know, but you say China really hurts U.S. intellectual property, which it does, but you're going to get more bang for your buck. So in a sense, China, just by being kind of bigger and but bigger than these other entities, you know, is a slower moving and larger target. So even if, you know, we stood aside and said, hey, you know, let's try not to, you know, let's take Xi at his word and see what's going to happen. Even if it happened at the executive level, you know, just politics in the U.S. I don't think would let that happen. And so that would be the kind of the bookend to me starting out with talking about bureaucracies. We've also got constituents and stuff.
Cool. Thank you. If you could all join me in thanking our wonderful
Okay, thank you all so much. Let me just say a few words. We're not gonna cut to a break. We're not gonna do it. I just want to. I know it's late. I know you want to go. And so I just want to do two things. First of all, I want to announce the winner of the 2015 CAPS photo contest. Okay, there we go. Amanda, the check's in the mail. Congratulations.
Thanks. I think we're going for dim sum.
Excellent. Okay, sounds good. That'll be money well spent. Well, let me just say then a few words then, closing remarks. There's a lot too much for me to really summarize in terms of what's happened today. We've had three, I think, really useful kind of learnings. We've had three wonderful panels, present company excluded, that I think have really done more than I really hoped to give us an idea of the various facets of the CAPS program, both in terms of what it does, but also in terms of what it can do. Dean Ritter spoke about what CAPS has achieved in the past, but then also what it can do in the future. And that's really something that a number of us in this room are focusing on. And I was delighted to hear what the students were. This was not 100 Flowers campaign where we were, yes, what's wrong with the CAPS program? I wasn't going to turn that into an anti-rights campaign. In fact, what was really, really interesting and worth and heartening to me is that a number of the points that you raised are precisely those things that we're talking about and trying to put into place. And so it's really, really good that we've got, that we're identifying the same shortcomings and the same problems and moving forward in the right way. There are a lot of different initiatives that we're working on. I can talk about a few of them here. Just very, very briefly. So a number of us in this room are working on developing the curriculum, the CAPS curriculum, and to develop ways in which to recruit more students into our ranks. One of the things that we really like to focus on is to work with other disciplines besides the traditional ones of history and government, to bring in more of a humanities dimension to the CAPS program, perhaps even a humanities track. We're also working with other colleges in our group of, I don't know how many of us, maybe 8 or 9 people in the CAPS Curriculum Development Committee. We had our first meeting on Monday, and out of those 8 or 9 people, we were representing 4 colleges on campus. We had a wonderful meeting that really got a number of us, all of us really thinking about stuff, and Hayan and I have been trying to keep pace with all the emails we've been getting, from that meeting. We even have some shorter to longer term ideas as well. So in addition to Cornell and Washington, one of the things that we're thinking about is for those CAP students that are more interested in a finance related track, about possibly doing some sort of off-campus semester in New York City, which is more of a financial capital. And for those of you who are on the more artistic track, same difference. I mean, same thing. Where there's been some talk about New York being a site for an off-campus semester focusing on the humanities. We have also been talking about Chinese language content courses. So somebody here mentioned diplomatic Chinese. As I remember when I was a graduate student, at Michigan they offered contemporary social science texts as a fourth-year Chinese language class, which was wonderful. Unfortunately, I missed that when it was taught by the son of then Foreign Minister Chen Qi-ten, and who looks just like his father. I remember walking into his office hours and just, and I'm sure he got that a lot because he didn't but I mean, he was exactly like his dad. So that's also something that I'd love to be able to do, but also to teach not just language classes, but actual content courses in Chinese. That's something that links with a number of other things that, a number of other initiatives at the university, not simply at the college level, and that's something that is, I think, is eminently doable. The last thing that I'll mention, just as a potential extension of CAPS, and this is something that's potentially quite dramatic. It's China and Asia Pacific studies, and so there's an increasing number of people from China or from Mandarin-speaking households who arrive at Cornell fully fluent in Mandarin, and so one of the ways in which we're thinking of possibly working with people with that type of a skill set is to work with them to develop another Asia Pacific language as a CAPS major. So whether it's Japanese or Korean, or moving to Southeast Asia to some of the less commonly taught languages, all of which are taught here at Cornell. So there's all sorts of ways in which we can go, and in the next days, weeks, months, and years, we will be doing precisely that. I'm not going to kind of repeat all the thanks that I did at the outset. I will. There are two people that I did miss. Walter Lefebvre and Ted Lowy, who Mike Zach did mention. In fact, they were there at the creation. And so I want to thank them as well. I want to thank all of you for not just showing up, but staying. I know some of you are a captive audience because I'm driving you back tomorrow. That's only 8 of you. The rest of you, some of you I haven't seen in years. Some of you I just saw last week. And some of you and all of you I hope to see for many, many years to come. So thank you all so very much, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your weekend. Thank you.